Welcome to today's webinar titled IBM's Deployment of DSIM Workflow. We want to thank you for the time you're going to be spending with us. If you have any questions during this webinar, please feel free to submit them into chat and we will try to get to all of them at the end of the webinar. My name is Mark Gatos. I'm Chief Marketing Officer at Endlight Software. I'll be sort of the host and moderator here. And we're fortunate today to have John Miller, who's a senior technical staff member. He's a DSIM architect over at IBM, and he'll be taking us through this informative presentation. John, why don't you take it over?
Thank you, Mark. Whenever I start a DSIM topic, I generally start with what we call our business needs, just so everyone's on the same page here. And this is what I use to show that where we've moved from what we called our legacy environment that did have some of the components of DSIM, but it was in a very non-cohesive manner that we were dealing with it. So what we tried to do then is organize this in a way and focus. First off, we looked at our requirements. What are our business needs? And while you can come up with a whole page of reasons why you need to do this, what we did was focus on two very high-level items here, one being resiliency, the other being data center resource optimization, and all the items that I mentioned below. But the reason being is then to do those two, you really had to do all of those other small tasks that we were brainstorming at the time. So these are the ones that really were the culmination of what we were doing. So with this business need in mind, we forged ahead with DSIM, Data Center Infrastructure Management. Obviously, at the stage we started, it was still trying to get people to even understand what it was, why it was needed. And this was a slide that we put together that kind of identified the different components that we wanted to cover, and at the same time that we might roll these out somewhat independently of one another. We knew that DSIM, the way we defined it, needed to make sure that they were capable of cross communication, total interdependency. For instance, when you are putting an asset in, that it's not location only that matters, it's all of these other things, power, network, cooling, timing, etc., that goes along with it. So, and to some degree, we also, we were certainly working already with data center facility management groups and IT service management, but we recognized this and called it a gap, that we were filling here, and we noted that this, extended the traditional DC facility management capabilities in such a way that we could now get the granular level of detail to run a data center and be able to handle, each client or department, that might have an infrastructure issue that wouldn't necessarily show up at a facility management layer. So with that, this sort of set the ground with the DSIM. We're going to move into a specific aspect of DSIM next, and that being workflow. We have other webinars that have been put out on the web that talk about some of the other aspects, but this one we felt required one of its own, because there's a lot of information we want to share here. In particular, what we talk about in IBM is we started out by doing what we called administration workflows. It was to help us manage some of the things that we wanted to keep at an administration level, like the security access, location definition, business groups, and materials. But at the same time, we wanted to make it capable that end users could at least submit a request to add a new location or a new business group or new material, et cetera. And at the same time, some of the tools we felt within Endlight, especially the bulk data management load, was not something that you wanted to give permission to absolutely everybody. And because of that, we have a core team that we said would handle the workflows for those requests, would have very specific templates built into the requests in the workflow that were used, but at the same time would flow through to an end user community that are the end user requests to an administrative community that would then be able to actually do a final validation and then load of that kind of information. So these have been ones that we started with. What we are currently in the process of is finalizing what we call our install, move, add, change, and decommissioning asset lifecycle. So this one, when we entered into this one, the idea with this was that you could have various levels of lifecycle workflow. In some cases, you may just need a very short path to, just replace a server on the data center. But what we did here was we recognized that if we built what we consider to be the most detailed and robust process that we have, and for IBM with our strategic outsourcing business that we're working in here, which means that we actually would go out and solicit deals with customers to bring their entire data center operations into our environment. And in order to do that, it had a fairly large breadth of everything from working with the deal team that's even putting out a bid on this through end of life. So we have built it to accommodate those stages and all the steps required in between. So what you're going to see that we're going to show is a very detailed one. You may not all use every stage of that, but what we recognize is that once you build it in Endlight, you can then very easily net that down to some smaller grouping of tasks that may not be required for every activity that you do. For instance, if it's just removing cables or adding patch or something like that, you may be able to take that and develop that as a subset very quickly from that very large and robust model that we put together. So with that, we said, well, first thing was we have to develop a process. Frankly, we didn't start from scratch. We had been working on process for some time, but what we wanted to do with the team we pulled together was make sure everyone was on the same page, or the ideas would come in, we'd dust it off and make sure we were still, all aligned on this. And so we started at a high level, and this just looking at 5 major tasks here, so to speak, or groups of tasks, and then starting to define it a little further about what that would capture within these different tasks. And that way we kind of, at least put out the right foundation for what we were doing, the key milestones, if you will. We further developed that process into and I'm not going to go through this in detail. I know you will thank me for that, but this is just to give you an idea that with that, we started looking at roles, activities, the sub-processes, and artifacts and deliverables that we needed to generate from a workflow. And the point being is that each of these tasks could be a simple thing like a deployment yes/no decision, or it could be something that actually has a fairly detailed sub-process associated with it. And not all of the sub-processes were ones that we were going to go out and map in Endlight. Some of them were actually externalized, but you could reach out and then bring that back into the workflow that we developed in Endlight. And it was very simple to do that with the capabilities that afforded. So this is just an example of what we ended up with, about 24 steps, not counting loopbacks and such. But the point I want to make here is that this got us also thinking about the other requirements, which were to identify, well, who's doing these major steps, and that's where here we were at least able to say, well, step 1 would be in this case an account representative submitting an initial request. Okay, so we knew that if it jumped from one role to another, that was where we needed to kind of stage it to another task level as we went through. So with that in mind, we then said, well, okay, now with the process and kind of understanding the roles and how the sub-processes and everything need to go together, we could start building a workflow application. Now, we also wanted to look at it in the context of that there's going to be a small group of people, administrators, who are going to actually do the build, who needed to learn how to use the tool to do that, to do these tasks we're looking at here. But at the same time, we wanted to make sure that the end user experience to the people who are going to be using this was very good. In fact, and I'll talk about that later when we get into some of the descoping we did on this, because we had in context of the user experience, and we didn't want it to be a very, very detailed and cumbersome process when we did that, but recognizing that they needed to be able to be able to select the process out of a list, that they needed to be able to, especially with the global nature of ours, that we could very quickly get it down to their location, not just the globe, and then address the appropriate tasks and such not. And this also, at the same time, we were looking to define the activities and in fact, one of the things that I loved about this was being able to define the entire scope, make it visible, and then where their piece fit into the mix here. So which all, I think all contributed to a much greater acceptance by the team by doing that. So we then were looking at the design side. How do we build it? And we said, well, we know it's built on a base of process, and that's why we looking at the processes initially, but it was defining these processes. For the most part, that you could kind of think of this as taking that flow chart I showed before and building it using the tool capabilities. But in addition to that, it's also form-based. So what that meant is that any one of these tasks could have one or more forms associated with it, or it may even just have what's called a workflow activity, which is like a widget that you could pull into a task, and it wouldn't necessarily have to have a form associated with it, but it would provide a process step that would be cohesive with going from one task to the next. So with this, we had from previous tools like notes applications that we had done portions of the preceding process, we were able to start building how we would take the data that we are asking for at various tasks, but group it into forms that we could then kind of manage forms with like type of data. But when you go to the different tasks, let me in fact go to the next chart here, you would find that on a particular form that same form might get used multiple times in different tasks. And it may be that just a portion of that form was used in a particular step, or as we said here, that for the different roles that are doing these tasks, it may be that the items on this form were editable at one task level, or read only on another task level, or completely hidden because they weren't necessary for a different level that we go through here. And that was accomplished by taking on another one of the tasks associated with building it, which is building your permissions. So what that meant is that permissions meant exactly that. For every field you have in the forms, that you did just have to identify those as whether they were editable at this task level, read, or hidden, and you did that at every task level. So that did become a bit of an exercise, but what we found is by doing that, two things. One is that was one of the things that we kind of recognized that we had too much and needed to back it off. We had initially like 10,000 permissions, because each cell here in the spreadsheet was a permission. And what we found though is that we needed to kind of rationalize what we had started with. And we were able to do that because of some of the widgets that were available and some of the synergy and some of the integrated things that we needed to do that were generic to the Endlight application itself, that we were able to net this down ultimately to about 2,500 permissions. But this then became sort of a checklist for each end user anyway. They could see what form they were on, and based on the over the top here, what role we were, what task level we were at, they could very easily just do an auto filter to say, hey, which ones do I have to edit on which form? And so that actually became a nice a supplement to the workflow. So when we do go through the testing and we have people to do it, we haven't actually hand them this and a process flow to kind of keep on track with it. So I talked about process rationalization. This is kind of the evolution we went through. I didn't hit every single stage, but you can see from version 1 through 7, and I think we hit version, I think this is 9 down here. I didn't number it, but what we identified is that there were certain things that just made sense that as we combined what we were doing before, but into this tool and its capabilities, we were able to net things down, and in different stages we found that, and in particular, if it was one that had the same role doing 2 or 3 steps in a row, it was like, well, why can't we combine that? And that's what you see is just a series of netting this down, and in some cases reordering it a little bit on the task. But we found even at the end of it, though, we made a kind of a more dramatic move, and that was we actually divided it into 2 processes, which, and by the nature of our business, this made very much sense. And that being that, if we were bringing in a large commitment for like a whole company's data center into our environment, that was not something that you do, in an overnight. and ultimately we had a project. We recognized that the first portion of what we were doing was what we deemed the project phase. And what that meant is that from the initial submission, we were taking a look at what it comprised in terms of content, but at the same time sizing that for cost purposes for the bid. But and then once there was given a go no go, we would take it to a certain point where before we then needed to get into some very detailed information that we really needed the account team to resubmit, at that point, sort of a much more detailed um, chart of what they needed, and not just assets, but the connectivity of those assets port to port. And what we found is we were able to utilize the core features of the tool to do that, which I'll show in a moment. But the point being is that, in particular, is that the total project, we said, isn't going to get deployed in one phase. It might get broken down over several weeks or months, depending on the size of the thing. And for that reason, the project phase captures the entirety of the project and any core planning that had to be done associated with that. But then the provisioning is where we could start chipping away at that one at a time with one or more multiple iterations in terms of, you could have more than one in progress at a given time, but at different stages of going through that. So we would have a parent workflow number associated with the parent, and every provision would be tied back to that parent number, as well as having its own unique provisioning workflow number on it. So this is just to give you an idea of, this is what we went through, because as we recognize this, anyone else doing this, you're going to probably go through some of these kind of iterations, and you're going to be looking at, well, sometimes the technology that you're using actually provides, some opportunities to do things a little different that may be a bit more user-friendly at the same time of capturing the totality of your objective, but in a different way than you did before. And that's what we found here. So with that, we said, let's take a look at as a sample workflow. And I'm just going to hit a couple of points in the workflow, because obviously it'd take a while to go through every step, where I'm not going to take you through me filling in data on a spreadsheet or on one of the forms as we go through it. But basically, we wanted to just point out the ease of the end user experience here, and that being, they would come out to the module for workflow in Endlight, and they would pick from a list of creating a request, and this isn't our final naming convention, but what we ultimately would end up with is something that, as I mentioned before, would be unique to by country. They would know if it's United States, it would say US. So right away they'd go to the one that was theirs, because what we found is in other countries there had to maybe be slight variations, particularly just driven by the permissions and things that we did on the forms. You didn't really have to reinvent the process, but just have some things that may be visible in one country that aren't in another. But ultimately they would pick that process. They would then just put in a name convention that we said for that name, so they can always easily go back and find it. And they would put in the location. In this case, as this represents a room in our tree structure that's generic to the tool, and just start it off at a start draft mode and click next. I mean, that's as easy as that. You get it started. And I jumped here to, I just want to point out there's a couple of dependencies we had, and one of them when we did our service requests is we also opted to utilize one of the tools that we had in the previous process, to help us. And this is where I just want to show that you can do this. You can easily just reach out. In this case, is in one of the workflow tasks, it has a web link out to this web application that we have. This is one that was used, in fact, even before the process kicks off or the workflow kicks off, that our deal team may be already, as they're working with a client, putting together what does that deal comprise in terms of the kinds of materials that it has and the quantities of those materials, and a few other bits of information about it. Some of these were if you actually already have it, and you're just moving it from site to site or something, where you'd put in some additional information. But this one page here would provide us the capability to very quickly build a scenario where we could do an estimate in a matter of minutes on what that would end up costing for the resources associated with these devices, and where would we likely be able to fit it and put it, we also found that when we looked at the autoloader filter in Endlight, that we could actually evolve this systematically by having it actually push this out into the same template that is required for the autoloader. So with that, the next page is exactly that. We said, okay, for any of those devices that were needed to be registered, which in some cases may be 100% if it's coming in from a client, some where we may be building it with a mix of stuff that was on site or it's off site and has to be shipped or it has to be procured or whatever, that we could actually group it. But this actually is a subset of that, which says that these are the ones we needed to push into autoloader to register as an asset. And we were able to put that into that code on the previous application to push out those that need to be registered into this particular default format, that we were able to, in seconds, just go ahead and load and register with that new autoloader filter. So this is just to kind of show you how we've integrated some of the specific bells and whistles that Endlight has continued to add as we go to make this a simpler process for us. And this one was very simple now to get an asset created. Then what we would do is jump back to the workflow, and this is, again, not every step that we go through, but one of the other key steps, which is now that we've got everything registered as an asset that we want to work with, we would go to one of our forms where we have the equipment picker widget, which is one of the devices that in the workflow that you just pull over and it builds this whole thing in one step. From there, we could click the little plus button. It would take us out to an add asset pop-up where we could put in one or in fact, even just by leaving off a character, a range of asset ID numbers that we were looking for, and click the add button to just bring that back into this interface. Now in this case, I only did one, but like I said, you could do multiples, and you can put in as many as you need here, and you could even do more than one at a time on that previous page. I've done some with 10 at a time, for example. The key here is, though, once you've got it back to this task in the workflow, this is an interface from which you can click the little eyeball here and it will open up that asset in the actual operational asset view in the tool. And this was really cool because obviously this is where most of our end users were trained on how to utilize as they're looking at the tool. This is obviously one of many screens, but this is probably the primary one, the one they spend the most time on in terms of building out all the attributes of the asset they've created. And that's what this is, exactly what we needed them to do. They have a list of then things they need to do. They need to identify what cabinet is it mounted in, if it's a rack mount device, or what blade it goes into what chassis, and subsequently into the cabinet. What is the location on the floor, the grid location, the U number that is going in the rack. And at the same time, all of these different items that are either on your screen here, and it's all you probably know that you can customize your screen, so it may not look like this exactly, but these are the little items down below where you can click it and it'll bring it up to the top. This is kind of the standard that we've mapped out that we like to use, that they can get most quickly to the most used windows here. And the point being is they would know then to for any of the additional attributes that are required, putting in the purchase number or in fact a PR number that we use for the workflow number, and other asset information like patch and cable connections, power connections, custom fields, etc., would all be done through this interface. And through this interface, could at any time you could click on the work order, view work order, which would actually then immediately spit out a document that is mapped to everything you asked it to do. And I'll talk about that a little bit further. This is an example of one here. The point being is that you could do that at that asset view page, or you could do this when you come back to your workflow, and in that equipment picker that we saw, you could also click a view work order at that stage. Either one would bring up, based on that one asset that you were looking at one at a time, that it would provide you. In this case, we brought in a device, we loaded it, we hooked it up to power, we've put all these port connections in, and this is basically ready to hand to your whoever is going to actually go out and deploy this. These are the instructions, and they are very comprehensive, and would so you can see the seamless nature of this. You basically can build this into the tool, but instead of copying spreadsheets, passing that around, you've built an iterative set of data that has probably been worked on by various stages of from a power guide to a network guide, et cetera, that can ultimately end up with here's what you need to do here. So with that, let me jump to one other kind of in-between thing that we also have the goods receiving module that we're using in the workflow. Now, since we already have created them as assets, we don't, in our workflow process, we're not using this one for the creation of assets, which you could do with the goods receiving, but we're going straight to search because, as I mentioned before, one of the things, if it's a purchase order that they put in that for that particular asset or multiple assets, on goods receiving, that's one of the key fields that someone could just put in and click search, and it would bring up a list of anything that's associated with that purchase order number, or they could put in a shipment number or something, anything that may pull up a list of things that that the asset management or the group who is receiving this at the dock and the warehouse and the various stages would be able to capture this and then be able to push it through the system. So they would go from this point where they would, like I said, search on a work order number, for example, or any other key field that might make sense for searching it to capture the data down here, and then they would go to a second page on this one, and it only has the 2 panels for this that you have to worry about. But with this, you could fill in some additional information. You'll see the specific location that it's destined for. You could put in other cost center information. It does bring in some that's generic to that asset, like the material types and subtypes, et cetera. But then you can, down below is where you want to start putting in the unique information that of this asset when you receive it. So you could just, through with a scanner, you just click the cell and scan, click and scan, click and scan on each of these parameters here, and very quickly could go through a very large list of items to scan that into the Endlight system. So that's adding all these attributes right here, on as soon as they receive this. So I'm going to move then to, I wanted to talk about the work order. I talked about the one before, which was at the asset level, but they have another work order that's actually associated with the process, the workflow itself. And that one's kind of cool. We didn't expect this, and it was a very pleasant surprise, because what we found is that this generates a comprehensive look at the entirety of that workflow. Now, in this case, I netted this one down a little bit. I mentioned it before, I had like 10 or so forms, and I netted it to some of the key ones here, but it would generate it all in one page, and you could parse it out however you want. You can push it out as a PDF, or it comes out generically as one. You could just click and it would launch to a web, open up in the web but you could pass it on to somebody else, or like I said, copy it to another, or not copy, but transform it into a PDF or something for other purposes. But the net of it was that this would talk about all the stuff you put into your workflow. And it would capture that initial information just because you kicked one off. It would then start filling out the form data that you've done. The interesting thing is when you went to the equipment picker, it would actually bring in that list with hypertext links from here that you could jump right back to that asset view that we talked about before. So this one becomes a good one for even midway through the process if you want to have that list and be able to quickly jump to your list of equipment or add to it. Even if it's outside the process flow per se, the guy who's submitting this could even still continue to add more attribute information to those assets, even as it's getting pushed through the system. Ultimately, though, we also look at this as documenting the progress of the workflow. So we would be able to note, when it's gotten down to the final stages, where it's in effect at our final stages, it would be where we're, recording any single cord risk mitigation issues, and a final look at it and validation of everything, and then we would be at the end of the process and have this as a record of everything that had been done during that stage. So this was really good thing. Now, one of the things that I wanted to kind of talk about was as we started doing this workflow, and as word got around, as the capability of Endlight in general, we did get a lot of interest from other groups within the company. And I kind of highlight this one because this one was little bit unexpected. I remember when I first started looking at DSIM, I never in my wildest dreams thought we would displace one of our enterprise level processes in the company. And I'm not saying we've displaced it, but what we've done here is in partnering with our asset management group at a global level, they recognized that there was a massive amount of synergy in regard to the DSIM tool data that we collect. The fact that we collect it and are using it for managing and ensuring resiliency of power systems and network systems, they recognized that to do that, we had to have a pretty good handle on it, and that the data must be in pretty good shape to do that. And therefore, this became one of the trusted sources that they do use throughout their process. We've fully integrated, and some of the things I even talked about, like the goods receiving module, are things that are actually going to be done by that particular team. But they are one of the roles that will now participate in using the tool to do that. So this is, like I said, was one good example. What's not the only one. We're also working with our IBM research team and other teams that have found that there's a lot. In fact, to me, that was the major reason we wanted DSIM, is that we could expose data, especially location data of equipment that the IT service management guys could use, so they can easily track something down in the data center, so they can relate it back to events and things that we may need that may be tracking on the DSIM side that they're not looking at, that may require a transfer of workload from one site to another to mitigate risk, et cetera. And this is kind of one of the examples where we could do it. We're following up with APIs, the RFID API that Endlight provided, but at the same time building a couple of others between our order now system, as well as one of our other systems for shipment and site transfers and things like that, and up to disposal services that we can build through here. So just to kind of end the presentation, I'm going back to a chart you saw before. As I mentioned, we're at the cusp of deploying this particular one on the lifecycle management. And in fact, the only thing that delayed it was the integration of that asset management team. When we were just about to go with it, they said, "Hey, can you hold up and do this?" Which was a good thing for all of us. But at the same time, we did have these administration ones done years ago. In fact, they were very useful right from the beginning, like I said, to kind of make sure that you didn't have to give permissions to everyone that were a little bit more than you wanted to, but you could actually still give them a means to input requests and then process them. So those have been very very good for us. They've been very successful. People are very pleased with that because they know that they can drive this very quickly. It actually did drive the time to do these things dramatically down. And obviously with the workflow, one of the things I didn't mention is it will of course track a SLA, what the expected time is, and then if you don't make it in that time, someone will get alerted. But with this, we were able to drive almost everything here in terms of security, location, business group, and materials down to less than a day turnaround on being able to accomplish those for the end users. So let me stop there and just open it up for any questions. So.
Okay, thanks, John, for that. We do have some questions that come in. We'll try to get to a few of them here. And if we don't get to your question here, we will try to get to it offline. So the first question is from Peter, which is, how were you handling the workflow process before you deployed the system?
Now, that's a good question. As I mentioned before, it wasn't like we started out from scratch when we did this one, but it was with piece parts. We had Lotus Notes applications that we used here in IBM pervasively. And in fact, those did provide some capabilities that we found we had to find workarounds for in Endlight because it was very easy to move back and forth between, for collaboration on some of the steps there that we found that, frankly, we were able to streamline it in this application, but it was one where you had to think of it differently. But the key was that what we found is that that application, and of course people who use Lotus Notes know that you can build some applications within them that are very powerful. But for the most part, it was attaching spreadsheets to it and moving it along from one end user to the next on the task level, maybe doing a do loop, etc. What it didn't really bring was any kind of integration into the core tool that Endlight brings. As I mentioned to you, where it directly interfaces with the asset view, and at the same time, it also became more of a one-stop shop for the other web apps and things like that that you typically have to jump out to for various stages of your process. That we were able to actually centralize that in the Endlight workflow. So, but yeah, it was a good start for us with those tools. In fact, even it kind of made sense when the split that I talked about from project to provisioning really was more closely aligned to what we were doing in our notes with two different groups, one that did the initial project and one that basically did what we called all the provisioning piece of it. So that actually aligned very much. So I would say definitely look at anything you have from the past and build, think about that when you're building your process. You don't have to completely change it, but you will want to take advantage of the widgets and automation and links and things you can do with Endlight that will, and in our case, certainly led to changes and certainly a reduction in the number of tasks and that sort of thing.
Okay, great. Our next question is from Dee Dee. How easy is it to change a workflow?
Yes, that's a good question, and that's one that it depends on your skill level, because I will tell you that it's not like just the general end user is going to open that up and start doing it from scratch. You will have to do some training on it. For us, we had a couple of, or 3 or 4 guys that decided they kind of wanted to learn that and started playing around with it, and that was the thing we found was the easiest thing first after looking at a few overviews and such, was just to go in and play around. And what we found is, certainly once you understood it a little bit better, that changing it was not that difficult. Of course, that's the question is one which it depends on how radical the change, of course, as well, on that. But for the kind of variations and things that we were doing, it was not difficult at all. Changing a form was and the content of that form very, very simple, and then you could just republish it very quickly. Adding a task was not difficult. Where it got a bit more difficult was if you are adding, some of the branch and other major things that all have to kind of synchronize in a certain way. That I would say, for us was sort of a step 2. I'll put it that we kind of learned what I mentioned before very quickly. The other one took a little longer. But it's still it's very manageable to go in and do that. I'm just saying that you would need some training to do that, and the training would be available in the through Endlight or probably online sources.
Okay, thank you, John. We'll take 2 more questions here. This next one is from Claudio. Was all this worth it? What are you seeing has improved?
Definitely worth it, because one of the things that we wanted to accomplish that we couldn't do really very well in Notes was 2 things. One is because it was separated into 2 things, we kind of left it open-ended on the project side. It was like, well, here's all the stuff you need to do, and then as it was going through the deployment side, we really never knew to what degree it was done. It was at 50%, 100%. So we never really understood the pipeline as well as we do now, and know exactly what's in it. We can now track it at every stage. We know what percentage is done, especially with the iterative nature of what we did here. Now that we can track, what's done, what's left to go. Yeah, the other thing in terms of worth, and we knew going in that what we wanted to do was be able to look at compliance, and this is workforce compliance, and it's not that we don't trust our employees and that sort of thing. The point was that what we wanted to be able to do was 2 things with that. Is one, provide the employee or the end users a view of the overall project and where theirs fit in, so that they would kind of understand who's dependent upon them and who they're dependent upon, and that their process doesn't take 15 steps to do that. before they can pass it along. It was one, giving them visibility to the process and their role in that process. The other was with SLAs, et cetera. It was in fact tracking, you know, are they doing it, you know, in fact, down to the personnel level of, you know, do we have people that are struggling with getting that done, or and therefore need retraining or additional training, or there are people that are just not doing it, which need some other attention, et cetera, on this sort of thing. But and tracking, you know, and this was also a way that contributed to some of the KPI metrics we were doing in terms of being able to now, you know, kind of quantify, you know, what was done and the timing it takes and this, that, and the other. So those things, and like they say, if you can't measure it, you can't really manage it and improve it. And those are things that we definitely found useful, because it does help us get visibility, and not in a bad way. It's not like we're looking for people to make mistakes or poor performance, but it's looking at ways to improve it, you know, by at least being aware, and them being aware, and knowing better where to go and what to do.
And our last question is from Dan. Did this integrate with a ticketing or change management system?
It didn't. Well, let me step back. It did at the beginning, where I talked about a service request. That was where we used the Lotus Notes, though, as a method. It didn't really go through in a formalized change management system at that time. But that was started really before IBM started using things like ServiceNow, et cetera. But at this stage, what we're looking at is the ticket actually does start with the Endlight workflow for us on this one, because when we worked with asset management, we pointed out the fact that ours starts with the concept, the idea. I mean, it's literally the very first step. It's an account team coming to us and saying, look, or someone who's wanting to acquire an account, saying we're going to go make a bid on this account, which doesn't even exist. There are no assets yet to put tickets in for. So by that nature, it starts with us with the, I guess you would call the original ticket. But as we do integrate further with, as I pointed out, with asset management in particular, it will integrate with their, what they call their order now system, purchasing system. It will integrate with their systems that provide transportation, shipping site to site, others where it's go end of life. So it in fact, that's where it's been really good, is because it does integrate with those other groups who are part of the life cycle. And while we may plan it, we're not following through on the whole execution of it. And now we can actually do that in that partnership.
Okay, thank you for the answer, John. We didn't get to all the questions, but we will get to them all offline. Sorry for those that we didn't get to. And again, I'd like to thank John for the time you've given us, and that was a very informative presentation. And we look forward to seeing everyone who attended the webinar on future webinars. Thank you again for your time, and we'll see you on future webinars. Thank you.